The Bulan fleet's desperate stand. The silence of space was shattered by the relentless hum of alarms echoing through the corridors of the Bulan starship. Murloc, lying on his bunk, let his body relax for just a moment as his mind raced. The war had been dragging on for years, but it felt like time itself was running out. His eyes flicked to the small porthole near his bed, through which the stars appeared as cold, distant lights. They seemed so far away, untouched by the violence of war, yet that same vast emptiness now bore witness to their suffering. The once hopeful dream of the Bulan, a race of peacekeepers, defenders of their colonies, now seemed nothing more than a fading memory, swallowed by the overwhelming tide of destruction. 3 years. That's all it had taken. The Thren warlords, relentless and merciless, had systematically annihilated over a dozen Bulan colonies. Whole cities were reduced to molten rubble, the remnants of Bulan civilization consumed by the inferno of plasma fire. Worse still, their birthing pools, sacred and vital for the continuation of their species, had been destroyed, and countless larvae had been massacred before they had a chance to grow. Murloc's fists clenched as he thought about his homeworld. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside, the faint echo growing louder. A moment later, his wingmate Cavil appeared, his steps heavy and weary. Another wave of defeat hung in the air like a thick fog. Cavil's eyes were downcast, his mandibles twitching with exhaustion. He had always been the optimist, the one who believed in their cause. But now, the weight of reality was finally sinking in. Another colony gone, Cavil muttered, flopping down onto the bunk across from Murloc. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the crushing weight of despair. Millions, just wiped out. Our people, Murloc, we're on the brink of extinction. Murloc didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the wall, his mind running through the calculations, the facts, the brutal truth of their situation. They were outmatched, outgunned, and surrounded. Every attempt to rally more forces had been in vain, and their retreat was all they had left. For the first time in his life, Murloc felt the true weight of his species' mortality. The war had been long, but this was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a countdown to extinction. The Bulan couldn't hold on much longer. The Thren were too powerful. Their ships, massive and terrifying, tore through the Bulan defense lines with ease. There were simply too many of them. The Bulan fleet was a fraction of what it once was, now reduced to a handful of ships, their hulls battered and scarred, their crews weary and demoralized. But even as despair threatened to consume him, a glimmer of something else sparked in Murloc's chest. He had heard the whispers, the rumors of a race far beyond the stars, a race that had once been seen as primitive and weak, but had since proven itself to be formidable beyond measure. The humans. His heart raced as he thought about the warnings he had received from their allies, about the time when the humans had offered help. There had been hesitation, distrust. After all, the galaxy had long mocked humanity for their naivety. But Murloc knew what he had to do. There was no other choice. If they didn't reach out to the humans now, the Bulan might never have another chance. "We need to do it, Cavil," Murloc said, his voice steady, though the storm of uncertainty raged within him. "We need to ask for their help. We need the humans." Cavil's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you out of your mind? You want to bring them into this? The same humans who have been mocked and dismissed by every race they've ever encountered?" "Yes," Murloc replied, his voice rising with urgency. "They offered to help us before. We ignored them, dismissed them. But now we have nothing left. If we don't ask for their help, we're finished. We're already dead in the eyes of the Thren. At least the humans might give us a fighting chance." Cavil let out a long, frustrated sigh, slumping further into his bunk. "You're asking me to trust the same species that's been laughed at by every major race in the galaxy." The Dolan scoffed at them. The Sleen didn't even take them seriously when they first met. What's to stop the humans from deciding we're just another resource to exploit? Murlock's mind flashed back to the stories of humanity's past, the ways they had been exploited and used by other races. The Dolans had mocked them at the Grand Assembly, scornfully dismissing their advancements and their technology. The humans, with their powerful fusion reactors and sleek starships, had been brushed aside. Yet, against all odds, they had continued to push forward. They had learned from their failures and refused to be defeated. The irony wasn't lost on Murlock. The Bulan, once a proud race capable of defending themselves, were now in the position of seeking help from the very species that had once been laughed at. But perhaps in that irony, there was a lesson the Bulan needed to learn if they were to survive. "Listen, Cavil," Murlock said, leaning forward, his voice taking on an almost desperate tone. "We've tried everything else. We've begged, we've fought, we've retreated. And the Thren keep coming. If we want to survive, we need to adapt. The humans, they're survivors too. They've been pushed to the brink, and they'd fought back. Maybe they can show us how to do the same." Cavil was silent for a long moment. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air, the uncertainty palpable. But as the alarm sounded once more, signaling yet another Thren fleet on the horizon, Cavil finally nodded. His mandibles clicked together in resignation. "Fine, I'll back you on this. But if this goes south, Murlock, it's on you." Murlock's heart surged with a mixture of relief and fear. He knew the risks, but the alternative was certain death. If humanity would stand with them, perhaps there was still hope. As he began transmitting the message to humanity's distant embassies, Murlock couldn't help but wonder, could the humans truly be their salvation? The war had already cost so much, and the threat of annihilation loomed over them. But now, for the first time in years, Murlock felt something different, something he hadn't felt in far too long. Hope. The time for waiting was over. The time for action had come. The fate of the Bulan would rest on the willingness of humanity to answer their call. And as the message was sent into the void, Murlock couldn't help but wonder if they were about to face their greatest challenge yet, or if this new alliance would be the key to surviving the Thren's relentless assault. The next few moments would decide everything. The rejection of humanity's offer. Murlock sat nervously in his chamber aboard the Bulan starship, his thoughts swirling like a storm. The message had been sent. The request for humanity's assistance had been made. It was all in their hands now. All he could do was wait. Time, which had seemed to drag on endlessly as they fled the Thren, now felt like a relentless beast that chewed through his every second. The silence in his quarters was broken only by the occasional hiss of the ship's ventilation system, a sound so ordinary that it now seemed like a cruel reminder of the Bulan's impending doom. Cavil paced restlessly, his eyes scanning the blinking lights on the walls as if willing them to offer some hint of hope. His usual skepticism had given way to something else, a kind of weary resignation. They had already lost so much. The destruction of their colonies, the loss of millions, the constant flight from the Thren. Everything pointed to the fact that the Bulan's end was near unless something drastic happened. Yet the idea of relying on the humans felt more than a little unnatural, as though it went against the very fabric of what the Bulan stood for. They were survivors, warriors with a rich culture of defense and honor. The humans, on the other hand, were a race that had barely scratched the surface of space, only to be mocked by the galaxy's elder species. "I still can't believe we're doing this," Cavil muttered, breaking the silence that had enveloped the room. His voice was a mix of disbelief and frustration. "We've survived for centuries, Murlock. Now we're turning to the same species that can barely hold its own in galactic politics." Murlock didn't answer right away. He was too deep in thought. He had seen the humans' resilience firsthand. They may have been mocked, belittled, and underestimated by every major power in the galaxy, but time and time again, they had found ways to rise from the ashes. It wasn't just their technology that made them formidable, it was their spirit, the unyielding determination to survive and thrive, no matter the odds. When the transmission finally came, it was brief. The message was sent from a human-controlled space station in a distant part of the galaxy, and it brought a glimmer of both hope and hesitation. The human diplomat's words were measured and guarded. "Your plea has been heard, Bulan." The diplomat's voice crackled through the communication panel. "But before we proceed further, know this. The humans have been mocked and exploited by other races for centuries. We do not extend our help lightly. Your request for assistance will be evaluated, but we have conditions." Murlock's heart sank. Conditions. He knew what that meant. Nothing in life came for free, and the galaxy had learned that lesson the hard way. The Dolans had dismissed humanity's technological prowess as nothing more than a novelty. They had exploited the humans, taking their resources without even a thought of repayment. The Sleen, too, had played humanity as a pawn in their power games. Now, here the humans were, holding their cards close to their chest, unwilling to give an inch without assurance of something in return. Cavill's voice broke through Murlock's thoughts. "I told you. This is exactly why we shouldn't trust them. Who knows what they want in return?" Murlock's mind raced as he listened to the diplomat continue. "We cannot afford to extend our assistance to any species without ensuring that our interests will be safeguarded. The galaxy is a dangerous place, and we have no intention of allowing ourselves to be drawn into another war because of misplaced trust." Despite the diplomat's cold tone, Murlock could detect a hint of curiosity behind the words. The humans weren't dismissing them outright, but they weren't exactly offering a hand of friendship either. The message continued. "We will send a delegation to meet with your leaders. If you can prove that your cause is worth supporting, we may consider providing the aid you seek. But I caution you, we do not have the luxury of making hasty decisions." Murlock's mind raced with the implications of the message. He had known that humanity would not give help freely, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it all the more real. The diplomat's caution was not surprising. After all, humanity had been burned by the galaxy's political games before, but still, it stung. He had hoped for more, for a genuine desire to help. Instead, all he had gotten was a cold, calculated response. "What do we do now?" Cavill asked, his voice flat. The doubt in his words was unmistakable. It was as if the decision had already been made in his mind. They would fail, just as they had failed before. Murlock leaned against the wall, his arms crossed as he absorbed the weight of their situation. This was no longer just a matter of survival. It was a test of the Bulans' resolve. If they were going to succeed, they would need to show the humans that they were more than just a lost cause. They needed to prove that they were worth saving, that they had the strength to fight back, not only against the threat, but against the odds stacked against them. "We need to meet them," Murlock said, his voice steady but determined. "We need to show them that we're capable of more than just running. If they're going to help us, we have to prove ourselves worthy." Cavill's expression softened, though the skepticism didn't leave his eyes. "You really think that's going to work?" Murlock nodded. "It's our only option. We've seen what humanity can do. If they decide to help, they could be the difference between life and death for the Bulan." The arrival of the human delegation. Days passed, and with each passing hour, Murlock felt the pressure mounting. Time was slipping away. The Thren were closing in, and every second spent waiting felt like a countdown to their extinction. Finally, the day arrived. A human delegation arrived at the Bulan fleet's last remaining stronghold. Murlock and Cavill stood at the airlock, waiting to meet the humans. When the doors opened, they were greeted by a squad of human soldiers, their bodies clad in the sleek, dark armor of their elite forces. Behind them stood a woman, the diplomat who had communicated with them earlier. Her presence was commanding, yet not intimidating. She held herself with a quiet authority, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that made Murlock believe they weren't as indifferent as they seemed. "We have come to hear your plea," the diplomat said, her voice calm yet laced with an undeniable strength. "But make no mistake, Bulan. This is not a favor. It is a negotiation. If you want our help, you will need to prove that you can be trusted." Murloc stepped forward, trying to calm the rapid beating of his heart. He had never felt more vulnerable in his life. It was as if his species' fate rested in the hands of these strangers, who could just as easily turn away as offer their aid. "We understand," Murloc replied, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We have nothing left to lose. The Thren are relentless. We need your help, and we're willing to prove ourselves worthy of it." The diplomat regarded him for a long moment, her gaze sharp and calculating. She seemed to weigh his words carefully before nodding. "We will see if your actions match your words. Come with us. We have much to discuss." As Murloc followed the diplomat and her soldiers, he couldn't shake the feeling that their future hung by the thinnest of threads. This meeting, this moment, would determine everything. Would humanity help them, or would they dismiss the Bulan, just as every other race had? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the Bulan had no other choice but to try. Humanity's initial skepticism. The corridors of the human ship were starkly different from those aboard the Bulan starships. The walls gleamed with precision, and the hum of technology was sharp and purposeful. Murloc could feel the weight of his mission pressing against him with each step. The soldiers around him were vigilant, their eyes scanning the surroundings, their weapons not drawn but ready. The atmosphere was tense, and Murloc knew that his every move would be scrutinized. For the first time since he had boarded his ship, he felt the full extent of the vulnerability they faced. This wasn't just a diplomatic meeting. It was a test of the very essence of their species' survival. As they entered the command room, Murloc was struck by the sight of human officers and engineers busy at their stations. Their technology was more advanced than anything the Bulan had, but there was an undeniable sense of pragmatism in their movements. There was no ostentatious display of grandeur, no pompous sense of superiority, just focused intent on the task at hand. Murloc couldn't help but respect that. He had seen the arrogance of other galactic species, those who considered themselves superior simply because they had more advanced technology or greater numbers. The humans, however, had a humility about them that seemed almost paradoxical for a species that had been ridiculed for so long. The large, glass-paneled screen flashed as the human diplomat activated the transmission. Murloc's eyes fixed on it as the figure of a human commander appeared, his expression serious but not unfriendly. The commander's uniform was adorned with intricate patches and insignia, marking him as a high-ranking officer within their military. "I am Commander Allen," he said, his voice calm and commanding. "I have reviewed your request. Before we proceed, I must remind you that our resources are limited. The Thren threat, while formidable, is not our only concern. We cannot afford to divert our full attention to your war, especially without assurances that our intervention will not lead to further escalation. Every decision we make has consequences." Murloc swallowed hard, the weight of the words hanging heavy in the air. The humans had made their point clear. They were not desperate. They weren't going to rush in without considering the ramifications. Murloc had known it wouldn't be easy, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. He had hoped for more warmth, for a faster resolution, but the reality was that the humans weren't interested in saving a species simply because they were on the brink of extinction. Their help would have to be earned. "We are in no position to make promises," the commander continued, his tone still firm. "We've seen what happens when we intervene in conflicts we do not fully understand. We will need to know more about the Thren, about your strategies, and about your species' capacity to sustain yourself in the long term. What happens when the Thren are pushed back? Will you be able to defend yourselves, or will we simply be fighting alongside you again in the future?" Murloc felt a surge of frustration, but he bit it back. The humans weren't wrong to ask these questions. After all, they had learned the hard way. Many times, they had been exploited or left to fend for themselves by other galactic powers, only to realize that they had been too naive, too trusting. This was their opportunity to avoid making the same mistakes. "We will not ask you to fight our war forever," Murloc said, his voice steady and clear. "We know we are not a self-sufficient species right now, but we are willing to learn. We have lost much, but we are not defeated. If you help us now, we will rebuild. Together, we will not be a burden to you. We want to learn from your strength, your resilience. Teach us how to fight, how to defend ourselves. We will not ask for charity. We will stand with you as equals, if you will give us the chance." There was a long silence, and Murloc could feel the eyes of the humans in the room upon him. The diplomat's gaze softened for a moment, but only for an instant. Her face was unreadable, a mask of diplomacy that masked the uncertainty beneath. It was clear that the humans were weighing his words carefully, unsure of what to make of this unexpected plea. "You say you want to learn," Commander Allen said after a long pause. "But are you ready to do what it takes? Are you ready to be taught, to adapt and grow, even if that means putting aside old ways, old pride?" Murloc had to admit to himself that he didn't know if the Bulan were truly ready for that. For centuries, they had fought alone, relying on their technology and their tactics. To suddenly be forced to reconsider their entire way of life and embrace the teachings of another species felt both humbling and terrifying. But Murloc knew this was the only way forward. Their pride had already led them to the brink of extinction. Now was not the time to hold on to outdated ideals. "We are ready," Murloc said, his voice unwavering. "Our pride is nothing compared to the survival of our species. If it takes learning from you, from your ways, then we will. Teach us, Commander. Teach us how to survive." Commander Allen nodded, his expression unreadable. "We will deliberate further. We will send a team to observe your defenses, to evaluate your capabilities. We cannot afford to make mistakes. If we are to assist you, you will have to prove your commitment, not just in words, but in actions." Murloc felt his heart beat faster as he realized what this meant. The humans weren't offering immediate aid. They were setting conditions, setting a test that the Bulan would need to pass. But there was a part of him that felt strangely relieved. The Thren were not going to go away simply because the Bulan asked for help. There was no magical solution. The road to survival would be hard, and it would be filled with trials, but at least the humans were giving them a chance. They were testing their resolve, their willingness to change. As the meeting ended, Murloc and Cavil were escorted to a different part of the ship. The cold, sterile walls of the human vessel now seemed less intimidating, more like the backdrop to a new chapter in their lives. A chapter where the Bulan would have to prove they were worthy of survival. "We're not out of the woods yet," Cavil said, his voice low as they walked down the long metallic corridor. "You heard the commander. We've got to show them something. This isn't just about fighting the Thren anymore. It's about proving we deserve to live." Murloc nodded, his mind already racing with plans. The humans' skepticism wasn't unwarranted. They had every right to question whether the Bulan could be trusted, whether they would be able to adapt to this new way of fighting. But Murloc believed that they could. They had to. "We'll show them," Murloc said, his voice resolute. "We'll prove to them that we are worth saving. If they want proof, they'll get it." For the first time in a long while, Murloc felt the spark of hope reignite within him. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but now, at least, the Bulan had a chance. They had a chance to learn, to grow, and to fight alongside the humans. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Murloc believed they might actually have a fighting chance. A human encounter. The air aboard the human warship felt crisp, almost sterile, as Murloc and Cavil were led down a series of narrow, gleaming hallways. The bustling of the ship's crew around them echoed faintly in the distance, a constant reminder of the human efficiency that permeated the entire vessel. As they moved through the labyrinth of corridors, Murloc couldn't help but feel both awe and trepidation. The vastness of the ship seemed to dwarf anything the Bulan had ever known. The sheer scale of humanity's resources was staggering, yet there was a strange sense of humility in the way they operated. They were not flaunting their power. Instead, there was a quiet confidence in their every movement. Eventually, They were brought to a small, stark room where they were instructed to wait. A single table stood in the center, its surface reflective and cold, and a few chairs were positioned around it. It felt almost clinical, the absence of warmth a contrast to the urgency of their mission. Murlock's antennae twitched nervously as he sat, his thoughts turning to what had led him to this point. A few short years ago, the Bulan had been thriving, strong in their belief that their ways were enough to secure their survival. Now, here he was, seeking the aid of a race once deemed too primitive, too weak to be considered a serious ally. "Are you sure about this, Murlock?" Cavill's voice cut through the silence, his skepticism palpable. "You heard them. We have to prove ourselves to them. But how? We're a dying species. How do we show them that we're worth saving when we can barely defend ourselves against the threat?" Murlock's mandibles clenched as he stared at the polished surface of the table, deep in thought. Cavill was right. The Bulan had always prided themselves on their strength, their ability to defend their colonies and their way of life. Now, they were being asked to abandon that pride and trust in a foreign power, one that had been tested and tempered in the fires of galactic politics. Could they really adapt to a new way of life, a new way of survival? "We'll show them," Murlock finally said, his voice steady but firm. "We have no choice. We have to prove that we can be more than just survivors. We have to show them that we can be fighters. Not just in battle, but in how we live, how we adapt, and how we face the future." As the door to the room slid open, the human diplomat who had been their point of contact appeared once more, flanked by several armed guards. Her expression remained stoic, but there was something in her eyes that betrayed a flicker of curiosity. She was still sizing them up, still evaluating their worth. "We've decided," she said without preamble, her voice even. "You're not the first species to come to us for help, but you may be the first to truly have a chance at survival. The commander has agreed to observe your defenses. We'll need to see how you operate, how you fight, how you strategize. If we are to lend our strength to yours, we need to know that you're capable of standing on your own 2 feet. You will have to prove that your species is not only worthy of survival, but that you can contribute to a stronger galactic community." Murlock nodded, a tight knot of tension forming in his chest. The humans were blunt, but their words were not unkind. They were offering them a chance, not as a favor, but as a test. The Bulan had to show that they had the capacity to learn, to grow, and to evolve if they were going to survive in a galaxy that cared little for the weak. "How will we demonstrate this?" Murlock asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the anxiety swirling within him. The diplomat gestured to the screen behind her. "We will arrange a simulated combat exercise. We'll observe how you handle a variety of situations, how you strategize under pressure. The commander will be monitoring from a command center. This is not just a battle. This is an evaluation of your leadership, your resourcefulness, and your ability to adapt." Cavill looked uncomfortable, his eye stalks twitching with unease. "A simulation," he muttered. "What good will that do? It's not real combat. The Thren are not going to wait for us to practice our tactics." The diplomat turned to him, her eyes sharp. "Do not mistake this for a simple training exercise, Cavill. The purpose is to see how you think. It's not about having the best weapons or the largest fleet. It's about how you adapt, how you react to the unexpected. In real combat, the battlefield is always unpredictable. This simulation will test your ability to think on your feet, to innovate, and to learn from your mistakes." Murlock felt the weight of her words settle heavily in his chest. This was more than just proving they could fight. It was about showing that they could think, strategize, and outsmart their enemies. The Thren had superior firepower, but if the Bulan were to survive, they had to be clever, to use their intelligence and adaptability to their advantage. The diplomat motioned for them to follow her. "Prepare yourselves. You will have a few hours to familiarize yourselves with the simulation equipment. The exercise will take place in our training facilities. It will be difficult, but it is the only way to prove that you are worth the resources we would invest in your survival." Murloc and Cavil exchanged a glance. The tension between them was palpable. This was their moment to prove that they were more than just a dying species, that they could still contribute something of value to the galaxy. They were about to step into an environment unlike anything they had ever encountered, a world where strategy, resourcefulness, and innovation were just as important as firepower. The simulated combat. Murloc's heart raced as he entered the human training facility, the sterile walls and advanced technology surrounding him. The room was vast, filled with holographic projectors and interactive combat simulators. It was unlike anything the Bulan had ever seen. Their own military training focused on traditional combat, brute strength, superior weaponry, and tactics honed over centuries of warfare. But this was something entirely different. The human diplomat's voice echoed through the speakers. You will face several scenarios, each designed to test your abilities. There will be simulated combat against a variety of enemies, each more challenging than the last. Your success will depend on how you adapt, how you manage your resources, and how you lead your troops. This is not about strength alone. It's about intellect, strategy, and ingenuity. Murloc stood at the center of the facility, taking in the vast expanse of the virtual battleground. Cavil stood beside him, visibly tense but trying to remain focused. Murloc could feel his own anxiety, but he forced himself to breathe deeply. This was their chance to show the humans that they were more than just a species struggling to survive. They were still fighters. The simulation began, and suddenly, the room transformed. They were no longer in a sterile training facility, but in the middle of a battlefield. The ground was rocky and barren, the sky a dark red, and in the distance, the hum of alien engines could be heard. Murloc's eyes flicked to the simulation's interface, where holographic indicators marked their fleet and their resources. All right, Murloc said, turning to Cavil. We've got to think like the humans. This isn't about charging in headfirst. It's about outsmarting them. Cavil nodded, his eyes scanning the battlefield. I don't know if I can handle all this technology, but if we're going to survive, we'll have to figure it out quickly. The first wave of simulated enemy forces appeared, and the battle was on. The enemies were faster and better equipped, a mirror of the Thren's strength. The Bulan's fleet was outnumbered, but Murloc's mind raced. They couldn't win on firepower alone. They needed to use the terrain, outmaneuver the enemies, and hit them where they least expected. Murloc barked out orders, directing their fleet to take cover behind the rocky outcrops, using the environment to shield them from the simulated enemy's attacks. The enemy forces attempted to surround them, but Murloc anticipated their moves, leading the fleet into narrow canyons where their larger ships would be forced to split up. Cavil worked with the crew, coordinating fire from their ships, targeting weak points in the enemy's armor, exploiting their overconfidence. It was a battle of wits, not just weapons. As the simulation progressed, Murloc realized something profound. This wasn't just about fighting the enemy. It was about learning how to think like the humans, how to be adaptable in the face of overwhelming odds. The more they fought, the more they began to understand. The Bulan could not rely on brute strength alone. They had to rely on their intelligence, their ability to adjust and learn from each encounter. As the simulation ended, Murloc stood silently, panting from the exertion of the exercise. The simulation had been brutal, and though the Bulan had technically won, Murloc knew it wasn't about the outcome. It was about how they had fought, how they had adapted. They had faced an enemy far superior in numbers, much like the Thren, and had survived by using their minds rather than their strength. The human diplomat appeared, her expression neutral but observant. You did better than we expected, she said, nodding slowly. But this is only the beginning. If you wish for us to help you, you will need to prove that this wasn't just a fluke. You need to show that you can sustain this mindset, even when the real enemy arrives. Murloc looked at Cavil, his mind buzzing with possibilities. We're ready, Murloc said, his voice firm with new conviction. This was only the start. We will adapt, and we will win. together. The diplomat's lips curled into a small smile, though her eyes remained cautious. We shall see. But your actions today have earned you a place among the stars. And with that, Murloc knew that the Bulan's true test was just beginning. A glimmer of hope. The hum of the ship was constant, like the heartbeat of a giant machine. As Murloc walked alongside the human diplomat, a part of him felt as though he had entered a new era, a time when the survival of his people was no longer solely in their own hands. He couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the human technology that surrounded them. The sleek, efficient machines, the advanced tactical systems, and the pristine ships that seemed to glide through the stars without effort. Everything about humanity was a reminder of how far they had come from their humble beginnings. The diplomat, who had become the bridge between the Bulan and the humans, led them through a series of corridors that were equally efficient and utilitarian. They were still on the human warship, but it now felt more like an extension of their own home than a foreign space. The humans had not only provided them with a chance at survival, but had also offered a glimpse into a world where survival wasn't just about brute force. It was about intelligence, resourcefulness, and above all, adaptability. As they reached a secure room where the diplomatic negotiations would take place, Murloc's thoughts turned to the coming simulation, what they had learned, and what they still needed to prove. The test had been a grueling challenge, but it had shown them more than just how to fight. It had opened their eyes to a different way of thinking, one that involved strategy, resource management, and precise execution. The Bulan could no longer rely on the old ways of war. They had to evolve, just as humanity had done in the past. Inside the room, human officers were already seated, their posture formal, but not unfriendly. The air was charged with tension, a sense that the decisions made here would alter the course of the war for both the Bulan and the humans. Murloc and Cavil stood at attention, their eyes fixed ahead, knowing that this was their moment to make a case not just for their survival, but for a future where their people could thrive. The human diplomat gestured for them to sit. "We've reviewed your performance in the simulation," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "You have shown improvement, but there is still much to be done. This is not just a matter of fighting. It is about securing your future. The threat may be your immediate concern, but we also need to know that you can sustain yourselves once the Thren are no longer a threat." Murloc nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "We know we cannot rely on others forever. Our survival depends on our ability to defend ourselves, both from external threats and from ourselves. The Thren are not the only challenge we face. Our species has struggled for too long with internal divisions, outdated thinking, and fear. But if you are willing to help us, we will change. We will adapt to whatever challenges the future holds." Cavil, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "We know the Thren are relentless, but we are not without our own strengths. We have learned from the simulation, and we are ready to continue learning from you. If you will help us, we will fight, not just for our survival, but to prove that we are capable of standing on our own." The human diplomat listened intently, her eyes scanning each of them in turn. Murloc could sense that she was weighing their words, considering the risk involved in forming an alliance with the Bulan. It was clear that humanity had learned the hard way not to trust easily, especially when dealing with other species in the galaxy who had exploited their kindness. But this was different. The Bulan weren't asking for charity. They were asking for a chance to prove their worth. "We understand your position," the diplomat said, her voice softening slightly. "But trust, Murloc, is not something that can be given lightly. You've made progress, but we need to see more. We need to see a willingness to change, to adapt, and to overcome the old ways that have held you back." Murloc felt a shift inside him, a spark of resolve lighting up in his chest. This was it. The humans weren't asking for them to be perfect. They were asking for proof that they could rise above their past and fight for a better future. This was a challenge that the Bulan were ready to accept. "We will show you," Murloc said firmly. "We will prove that we can learn, that we can grow. and that we can contribute to the galactic community. If you help us, we will not only fight the Thren. We will build a future where the Bulan stand as equals, not as victims. The diplomat regarded him for a long moment, and Murloc could see the hesitation in her eyes. They were asking for a lot, and she knew that the stakes were high. But finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she nodded. Very well. We will extend our assistance. But know this is not a one-way street. If you wish to be our allies, you will need to honor the terms we set. We will offer you military support, but we expect you to respect the agreements we make. Your leadership must remain intact, and you must demonstrate your ability to govern yourselves, to build trust, and to never again fall into the old ways that led you here in the first place. Murloc's heart skipped a beat. They had done it. The humans were willing to help them, not just as saviors, but as partners. The road ahead would not be easy, but this was a chance to survive, a chance to rebuild. We understand, Murloc said, his voice steady with resolve. We will honor our commitments. We will learn from you, and we will ensure that we never make the same mistakes again. The diplomat gave a small, approving nod. Then the terms are agreed upon. We will begin preparations for the first phase of our cooperation immediately. Your people will have access to our technology, our training, and our resources. But in return, you must show that you are committed to this new path. No turning back. Training and preparation. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Murloc and Cavil were thrust into a series of training programs designed to teach the Bulan not only about advanced human technology, but also about the human mindset, how they fought, how they thought, and how they approached war. The training was intense. Human instructors pushed them harder than they had ever been pushed before, challenging them to think in ways they had never considered. They learned to think beyond mere combat, focusing on strategies for building long-term stability, teaching their species how to be self-sufficient, and how to approach problems with innovation and creative thinking. Murloc found himself immersed in this new way of thinking, but it wasn't without its challenges. The Bulan had long been a species that relied on tradition and strength, but now they had to learn the power of cooperation, patience, and planning. The humans didn't just teach them to fight. They taught them how to think through every decision, how to prioritize survival, and how to lead with integrity and vision. As the training continued, Murloc and Cavil began to see the results. The Bulan were adapting. They were learning how to think beyond the battlefield, how to use their strengths in ways that didn't rely solely on brute force. They were beginning to understand that survival wasn't just about overcoming their enemies. It was about ensuring that their species could thrive in the galaxy, no matter what came their way. In time, the Thren would come. They would return, as they always did, to test the Bulan. But Murloc now knew that they had something they never had before. An alliance with the humans, a partnership forged in the fires of desperation and cemented by trust. And as the first waves of Thren ships appeared on the horizon once more, Murloc felt a quiet confidence that he had never felt before. The Bulan were no longer alone. And this time, they had a real chance at survival. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The Bulan, with humanity's help, had a future. And it was a future worth fighting for.